Friedrich Nietzsche declared himself to be a psychologist who has not his peer. Most people know him as a controversial philosopher who proclaimed that God is dead and spoke of Superman. But what they miss is that he was actually the first depth psychologist, anticipating the discoveries of Freud, Jung and modern therapy by more than 50 years. He understood that beneath our conscious thoughts lie hidden drives, unconscious motivations and self-deceptive mechanisms that control our behavior. Nietzsche mapped out the psychological machinery behind concepts like resentment, power drives and self-creation decades before psychology became a formal science. He explained how people deceive themselves, how childhood experiences shape adult personalities, and how suffering can be transformed into strength. He described developmental stages that mirror modern theories of psychological growth. He invented therapeutic techniques that therapists use today without knowing their origin. This is not abstract philosophy, but practical psychology you can use to understand yourself and others in the modern world. Every concept we will explore has direct applications to contemporary issues like social media addiction, cancel culture, victim mentality, and the meaning crisis plaguing modern society. You will learn psychological mechanisms that explain why people behave the way they do and how you can use this knowledge to improve your own mental health and relationships. Nietzsche was not just a philosopher, but the first therapist of the soul. Part 1. The Psychology of Resentiment. How Toxic Anger Rewrites Reality. The psychological mechanism of resentment represents one of Nietzsche's most profound insights into human nature. This is not ordinary anger that explodes and then fades away. Resentment is a toxic psychological process that works like a slow poison in the mind, fundamentally altering how people perceive reality and construct their values. Understanding this mechanism gives you the key to recognizing one of the most destructive patterns in human psychology. Here is exactly how this psychological mechanism works, step by step. First, frustration occurs when someone feels blocked from achieving what they want or need. This initial frustration could be anything from economic powerlessness to social rejection to physical weakness. The crucial factor is that the person cannot take direct action to solve their problem, often because they lack power, ability, or opportunity. This leads to the second stage, which is rumination. The frustrated person obsesses over the injustice and replays scenarios in their mind over and over. They cannot stop thinking about their oppressor or the source of their frustration. This rumination feeds on itself, growing stronger and more bitter with each repetition. Unlike healthy anger, which motivates action and then dissipates, resentment creates a permanent state of brooding resentment. The person becomes addicted to their own suffering. Since they cannot get real revenge in the physical world, they create imaginary revenge fantasies where they triumph and their enemies suffer. This is the third stage, where imagination becomes a substitute for action. They construct elaborate mental scenarios where justice is finally served, where the powerful are brought low, where they themselves are vindicated. These fantasies provide temporary relief, but ultimately make the real situation worse because they prevent the person from adapting to reality. Finally, they invert values, declaring that their weakness is actually moral strength and that power itself is evil. This is the most crucial stage because it transforms a psychological defense mechanism into a complete world view. The weak person convinces themselves that being weak is actually superior to being strong. Suffering becomes a virtue, meekness becomes wisdom, and powerlessness becomes purity. This value inversion allows them to feel superior to their oppressors while remaining powerless. They win the moral battle while losing the practical war. This is not just historical analysis, but a psychological pattern you can observe everywhere today. Think about social media cancel culture, where people who feel powerless in their own lives gain a sense of moral superiority by attacking others online. They cannot compete with successful people directly, so they redefine success as corruption and failure as virtue. Think about victim mentality in modern therapy, where some people become so attached to their wounded identity that they resist healing. Think about political movements that promise to tear down the successful rather than build up the unsuccessful. These are all manifestations of the same psychological mechanism Nietzsche identified over a century ago. The antidote to ressentiment begins with recognition. Ask yourself, do I spend more time thinking about what others have done to me than what I can do for myself? Do I feel secretly pleased when successful people fail? Do I prefer to see myself as a victim rather than as someone with agency? Do I turn my weaknesses into virtues and my failures into moral victories? These questions can reveal whether ressentiment has taken root in your own psychology. Part 2. The will to power as the drive behind all human behavior. At the heart of Nietzsche's psychology lies his most controversial concept, the will to power. This is not about political domination or physical force, but about the fundamental drive that motivates all human behavior. Understanding the will to power gives you insight into the hidden engines that drive human action. It operates like what Freud would later call the libido, but instead of being primarily sexual, it is primarily creative and self-actualizing. The will to power is best understood as the drive to grow, to expand one's capabilities, to overcome obstacles, and to achieve mastery over oneself and one's environment. Every human action can be traced back to some expression of the will to power. When someone pursues knowledge, they are exercising power over ignorance. When someone creates art, they are exercising power over chaos by imposing form and meaning. When someone builds relationships, they are exercising power over isolation and meaninglessness. Even apparent self-sacrifice can be understood as the will to power operating at a higher level, where someone gains power over their own base impulses. This drive system operates largely below the level of consciousness. We rarely understand our own true motivations because they emerge from competing drive systems that operate automatically. The person who claims to be motivated by altruism may actually be motivated by the desire to feel superior to others. The person who claims to seek truth may actually be motivated by the desire to control others through knowledge. The person who claims to want success may actually be motivated by the desire to prove their worth to a parent who rejected them decades ago. Most of our behavior is driven by unconscious power drives that we rationalize after the fact. Modern neuroscience confirms Nietzsche's insights about unconscious motivation. Studies show that the brain initiates action before consciousness becomes aware of the decision to act. Our sense of conscious choice appears to be largely a post hoc rationalization of decisions made by unconscious processes. Behavioral economics demonstrates how our supposedly rational decisions are driven by emotional and unconscious factors. Social psychology reveals how much of our behavior is driven by the desire for status, power and control, even when we tell ourselves we are motivated by higher ideals. All of this validates Nietzsche's claim that the will to power is the master drive behind human behavior. In therapy, understanding the will to power can transform how we approach psychological problems. Instead of seeing symptoms as diseases to be eliminated, we can see them as misdirected expressions of the will to power. The depressed person may have turned their power drive inward, attacking themselves instead of engaging with the world. The anxious person may be trying to control outcomes by worrying about them obsessively. The addicted person may be seeking power over their emotional state through substances. In each case, the solution involves redirecting the will to power toward healthier expressions rather than simply suppressing it. The highest expression of the will to power is what Nietzsche called self-overcoming. This is the drive to transcend your current limitations and become more than you currently are. It requires courage because it means giving up familiar patterns and venturing into unknown territory. It requires discipline because it means choosing long-term growth over short-term comfort. But it leads to genuine empowerment and authentic self-realization. When you align your conscious goals with your unconscious drive for power, you become unstoppable. Part 3. Self-deception. We are unknown to ourselves. One of Nietzsche's most radical insights was that we are fundamentally unknown to ourselves. He argued that consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg, while the vast majority of our mental life operates in darkness. This was revolutionary thinking in an age that believed in the transparency of consciousness and the power of rational self-knowledge. Nietzsche understood that we systematically deceive ourselves about our own motivations, desires, and character. Self-deception operates through several psychological mechanisms that Nietzsche identified with startling accuracy. First, we rationalize our behavior after the fact, creating logical explanations for actions that were actually driven by unconscious impulses. A person might claim they ended a relationship for moral reasons when they were actually driven by fear of intimacy. They might say they chose a career for noble purposes when they were actually seeking their parents' approval. The rationalization feels completely authentic to them because consciousness constructs these explanations automatically. We become the authors of our own mythology. Second, we project our own unconscious traits onto others. The person who constantly accuses others of being selfish is usually the most selfish person in the room. The person who sees manipulation everywhere is usually the most manipulative. What we hate most in others is often what we cannot face in ourselves. This projection serves as a psychological defense mechanism that allows us to maintain a positive self-image while remaining unconscious of our own shadow qualities. We literally make other people carry the parts of ourselves we cannot accept. Third, we engage in what Nietzsche called noble self-deception. We tell ourselves stories about our character and motivations that make us feel good about ourselves. The businessman convinces himself he is creating value when he is actually exploiting workers. The parent convinces herself she is protecting her children when she is actually controlling them. The activist convinces himself he is fighting for justice when he is actually expressing his own resentment. These deceptions are not conscious lies, but unconscious narratives that protect our ego from uncomfortable truths. Modern psychology has validated Nietzsche's insights about self-deception. Research on cognitive biases shows that we systematically distort information to maintain positive self-regard. The fundamental attribution error demonstrates how we blame external factors for our failures, while crediting internal factors for our successes. Confirmation bias shows how we seek information that confirms our existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. The Dunning-Kruger effect reveals how the least competent people are often the most confident in their abilities. All of these biases serve to protect us from the painful truth about ourselves. The therapeutic implications are profound. Traditional therapy often assumes that insight leads to change, but Nietzsche understood that most people resist self-knowledge because it threatens their carefully constructed self-image. The goal is not to eliminate self-deception completely, which would be impossible and perhaps harmful, but to become aware of our most destructive delusions. This requires what Nietzsche called intellectual honesty, the courage to face uncomfortable truths about ourselves. It means questioning our motivations, examining our patterns, and admitting when we are wrong. It means becoming comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity rather than clinging to false certainties. Practical exercises for developing self-awareness include keeping a motivation journal where you record your stated reasons for actions and then examine them critically later. Ask yourself, what might be the real reason I did this? What would my enemies say about my motivations? What patterns do I see in my behavior that I have been ignoring? The goal is not self-flagellation, but honest self-examination that leads to greater authenticity and psychological freedom. When you stop deceiving yourself, you can start changing yourself. Part 4. The 3 Metamorphoses, Stages of Psychological Development. Nietzsche outlined a theory of psychological development that predates and anticipates modern developmental psychology. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he described 3 metamorphoses of the spirit: the camel, the lion, and the child. These represent distinct stages of psychological growth that every person must navigate to achieve psychological maturity and authentic selfhood. Understanding these stages helps you identify where you are in your own development and what comes next. The first stage is the camel, which represents the burden-bearing spirit. In this stage, the person accepts the values and expectations imposed by society, family, and tradition. They say, "What is the heaviest burden I can bear?" They willingly take on moral duties, social roles, and cultural expectations without questioning them. This stage is necessary for initial socialization and learning basic life skills. Children and young adults typically function as camels, absorbing the wisdom and rules of their culture. The camel stage involves learning discipline, responsibility, and social cooperation. The person develops work ethic, moral standards, and the ability to delay gratification. They learn to carry the weight of adult responsibilities and contribute to society. However, if someone remains stuck in the camel stage, they become what Nietzsche called a herd animal. They never develop independent judgment or authentic values. They remain forever dependent on external authority for guidance and validation. The second stage is the lion, which represents the destructive spirit that says no. In this stage, the person rebels against inherited values and external authority. They ask, "Why should I accept these rules and expectations?" The lion destroys old idols and rejects traditional morality. This is the stage of adolescent rebellion, midlife crisis, and spiritual awakening. The person discovers that the values they inherited may not serve their authentic self. The lion stage is characterized by criticism, rejection, and destruction of old patterns. The person says, "I will" instead of "thou shalt." They challenge authority, question traditions, and refuse to accept things simply because that is how they have always been done. This stage is necessary for developing psychological independence and discovering authentic values. However, if someone remains stuck in the lion stage, they become perpetually rebellious and destructive. They can tear down but cannot build up. The third stage is the child, which represents the creative spirit that says yes. In this stage, the person moves beyond both conformity and rebellion to create new values and meaning. The child is characterized by innocence, playfulness, and creative spontaneity. They have integrated the discipline of the camel and the independence of the lion into a new synthesis. They can create their own values while still functioning effectively in society. They say yes to life while maintaining their authentic individuality. Modern developmental psychology validates Nietzsche's three-stage model. Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development show similar patterns of initial conformity, adolescent rebellion, and mature integration. Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development move from conventional morality through post-conventional criticism to principled conscience. Spiral dynamics describes how consciousness evolves from traditional to modern to postmodern stages. All of these theories recognize that psychological maturity requires moving through phases of acceptance, rejection, and creative synthesis. Nietzsche was the first to map this developmental journey with such precision and insight. Part 5. Amor Fati. Love Your Fate as Radical Therapy. Amor Fati, or love of fate, represents Nietzsche's most radical therapeutic technique. This is not passive resignation or stoic acceptance, but an active embrace of everything that has happened in your life, including suffering and failure. It means saying yes to your entire existence, not despite the pain, but because of how the pain contributed to your growth. This psychological practice can transform your relationship to suffering and liberate you from the tyranny of regret. The technique works by completely reversing our normal relationship to unpleasant experiences. Instead of wishing things had been different, you learn to see how everything that happened was necessary for who you became. Instead of regretting your mistakes, you recognize how they taught you essential lessons. Instead of resenting your suffering, you appreciate how it developed your strength and compassion. This is not positive thinking or denial, but a profound reframing that changes the meaning of your entire life story. You stop being a victim of your past and become the author of your future. Amor Fati requires distinguishing between what happened and what the events mean. The facts of your life cannot be changed, but their significance is always open to reinterpretation. The trauma that seemed like pure destruction may have been what forced you to develop inner resources you never knew you had. The relationship that ended in heartbreak may have been what taught you what you really need in a partner. The career failure that felt devastating may have been what redirected you toward your true calling. When you learn to see the hidden gifts in apparent disasters, you develop emotional resilience and psychological freedom. This practice is supported by modern research on post-traumatic growth. Studies show that many people who experience significant trauma report positive changes, including increased appreciation for life, stronger relationships, greater personal strength, spiritual development, and new possibilities. The key factor is not the trauma itself, but how people interpret and integrate the experience. Those who can find meaning in their suffering often emerge stronger than before. Amor Fati provides a framework for actively cultivating this meaning-making process. Instead of waiting for growth to happen naturally, You can deliberately choose to love your fate. The technique has practical applications in therapy and personal development. When clients are stuck in victim narratives or consumed by regret, therapists can guide them through an Amor Fati exercise. First, identify a significant negative experience from your past. Second, list all the ways this experience contributed to your growth, strength, wisdom, or compassion. Third, imagine how your life would be different if this experience had never happened. Fourth, consider whether you would actually want to eliminate this experience given what you know now. Most people discover that they would not change their past even if they could, because it made them who they are. This realization is profoundly liberating. Amor Fati is not about being grateful for abuse or pretending that suffering is good. It is about taking radical responsibility for the meaning you create from your experiences. You cannot control what happens to you, but you can control what it means to you. When you truly embrace this power, you become emotionally unshakable. No external circumstance can defeat you because you have learned to transform any experience into fuel for your growth. This is the ultimate psychological freedom. Part 6. How Nietzsche Influenced Freud, The Birth of the Unconscious. Although Freud claimed he had not read Nietzsche to avoid being influenced by him, the parallels between their ideas are too striking to be coincidental. Nietzsche anticipated many of Freud's key insights about the unconscious mind, repression, and the hidden motivations behind human behavior. Understanding this connection reveals how Nietzsche's psychological insights laid the groundwork for modern psychoanalysis and depth psychology. He was exploring the unconscious decades before Freud made it famous. Nietzsche understood that consciousness is just a small part of mental life. He wrote that we are fundamentally unknown to ourselves and that our conscious thoughts are often elaborate rationalizations for unconscious drives. This directly anticipates Freud's model of the mind as divided between conscious ego, unconscious ID, and moral superego. Nietzsche recognized that beneath our civilized surface lie primitive drives and instincts that shape our behavior in ways we rarely understand. He saw that the mind actively keeps certain thoughts and feelings out of awareness to protect itself from psychological pain. This is essentially the mechanism of repression that Freud would later elaborate. The concept of sublimation, where primitive drives are transformed into higher cultural achievements, also appears in Nietzsche's work. He understood that art, philosophy, and moral ideals often emerge from the same psychological forces that drive more basic behaviors. The artist sublimates sexual energy into creative expression. The philosopher sublimates the will to power into the pursuit of truth. The moral reformer sublimates personal resentment into social justice campaigns. Nietzsche saw that civilization itself is built on the foundation of redirected instinctual energy. Nietzsche also anticipated Freud's insights about the psychological functions of dreams, fantasy, and imagination. He understood that dreams reveal unconscious wishes and conflicts that cannot be expressed directly. He recognized that people create elaborate fantasy lives to compensate for frustrations in reality. He saw that symptoms and behaviors often have symbolic meanings that require interpretation to understand. All of these insights would later become central to psychoanalytic theory and practice. Nietzsche was doing depth psychology before anyone called it that. The concept of psychological defense mechanisms also appears in Nietzsche's work. He described how people project their own unacceptable qualities onto others, rationalize their behavior with noble explanations, and displace their emotions onto safer targets. He understood that the mind has elaborate strategies for protecting itself from threatening information. He saw that people often believe their own lies and become trapped in self-deceptive narratives. These insights would later be systematized by Freud and his followers into a comprehensive theory of ego defenses. But Nietzsche identified the basic mechanisms first. Perhaps most importantly, Nietzsche understood that psychological healing requires making the unconscious conscious. He believed that people suffer because they are driven by forces they do not understand. The cure involves bringing these hidden drives into awareness so they can be consciously directed rather than unconsciously suffered. This is precisely the goal of psychoanalytic therapy. Nietzsche was practicing a form of depth psychology in his own life, using his writing as a means of self-analysis and self-understanding. He demonstrated that philosophical reflection could serve therapeutic purposes decades before Freud developed the talking cure. Part 7. How Nietzsche influenced Jung. The Shadow and Individuation. Carl Jung's debt to Nietzsche runs even deeper than Freud's, though Jung was more willing to acknowledge the influence. Jung spent years studying Nietzsche's work and even conducted seminars on Thus Spoke Zarathustra that lasted for several years. Many of Jung's most important concepts, including the shadow, individuation, and the integration of opposites, can be traced back to Nietzschean insights. Understanding this connection reveals how Nietzsche's psychology influenced one of the most important therapeutic approaches of the 20th century. The concept of the shadow, which Jung defined as the hidden, repressed, or denied aspects of personality, has clear Nietzschean origins. Nietzsche understood that every person contains contradictory impulses and that psychological health requires acknowledging rather than repressing these darker aspects. He wrote about the need to integrate what he called the Dionysian aspects of human nature, the wild, instinctual creative forces that civilized society tries to suppress. Jung's shadow work involves the same process of recognizing and integrating the parts of ourselves we prefer to deny. Nietzsche also anticipated Jung's concept of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, rather than who others expect you to be. He wrote extensively about the importance of creating your own values rather than simply inheriting them from society. He understood that psychological maturity requires moving beyond both conformity and rebellion to find your authentic path. This is precisely what Jung meant by individuation, the process of differentiating yourself from the collective while remaining connected to it. Both thinkers recognized that true selfhood requires enormous courage and continuous effort. You must be willing to stand alone when necessary, while still remaining engaged with the world. The integration of opposites, another central Jungian theme, also appears throughout Nietzsche's work. He understood that psychological wholeness requires embracing contradictory aspects of experience rather than choosing sides. Good and evil, strength and weakness, joy and suffering, creation and destruction all exist within every person. The goal is not to eliminate the negative poles, but to integrate them into a higher synthesis. Jung's concept of the transcendent function, which unites conscious and unconscious contents, reflects this same insight. Both thinkers rejected simplistic either-or thinking in favor of complex both-and solutions. Nietzsche's analysis of different psychological types also influenced Jung's development of typology. He wrote about the distinction between noble and slave types, active and reactive personalities, creators and followers. He understood that different people have fundamentally different psychological orientations that shape how they perceive and respond to the world. Jung elaborated this insight into his theory of psychological types, including introversion and extroversion, thinking and feeling, sensing and intuition. Both recognized that there is no single model of psychological health, but rather different paths suited to different temperaments. The key is to develop your natural gifts rather than trying to become someone you are not. Jung's approach to therapy also reflects Nietzschean influence. Instead of focusing primarily on pathology and symptoms, Jung emphasized growth, creativity, and self-realization. He saw therapy as a process of becoming more fully yourself rather than simply eliminating problems. This reflects Nietzsche's emphasis on self-creation and self-overcoming. Both understood that psychological healing involves discovering and expressing your unique potential rather than conforming to external standards of normalcy. They were interested in helping people become extraordinary rather than merely adjusted. The concept of the wounded healer, central to Jungian thought, also has Nietzschean roots. Nietzsche understood that suffering can be transformed into wisdom and that our greatest wounds often become our greatest strengths. He wrote about how philosophers and creators often emerge from the depths of personal crisis. Jung developed this insight into a therapeutic principle. The therapist's own woundedness becomes a source of healing power when properly integrated. Both recognized that psychological growth often requires going through darkness rather than around it. They saw crisis as opportunity and breakdown as potential breakthrough. Part 8. How Nietzsche influenced Adler, the inferiority complex and individual psychology. Alfred Adler's individual psychology shows perhaps the most direct influence from Nietzschean ideas. Adler explicitly acknowledged his debt to Nietzsche and incorporated the will to power directly into his psychological theory. He reinterpreted Nietzsche's concept as the fundamental drive to overcome feelings of inferiority and achieve superiority or mastery. This became the foundation for Adler's understanding of personality development and psychological dysfunction. Adler's most famous concept, the inferiority complex, emerged directly from his reading of Nietzsche. He understood that every person begins life in a position of weakness and dependency. Children are smaller, weaker, and less capable than adults, which creates natural feelings of inferiority. The healthy response is to strive to overcome these limitations through effort and growth. However, some people become fixated on their inferiority and develop a complex where they feel permanently inadequate. This drives them to either give up in despair or compensate through unhealthy power-seeking behaviors. Nietzsche's analysis of ressentiment directly influenced Adler's understanding of how inferiority feelings can become pathological. When people cannot overcome their limitations through direct effort, they may turn to indirect methods of gaining power. They might become victims who control others through guilt and sympathy, and they might become critics who tear down others to feel superior. They might become martyrs who gain power through suffering. All of these strategies reflect misdirected expressions of the will to power that ultimately reinforce feelings of inferiority. Adler also adopted Nietzsche's emphasis on individual uniqueness and self-creation. He rejected Freud's deterministic view that personality is fixed by early childhood experiences. Instead, he emphasized that people can choose how to respond to their circumstances and actively create their personality through their choices. This reflects Nietzsche's insight that we are not victims of our past, but authors of our future. Adler called this the creative self, the capacity to interpret experiences and choose responses based on individual goals and values. This was revolutionary thinking in an era dominated by biological and environmental determinism. The concept of social interest, central to Adlerian therapy, also has Nietzschean roots. Although Nietzsche is often mischaracterized as promoting pure individualism, he actually understood that humans are social creatures who need community to thrive. Adler developed this insight into his theory that psychological health requires balancing individual development with social contribution. The goal is not to dominate others, but to find your unique way of contributing to the common good. This reflects Nietzsche's vision of the higher type, who creates values that benefit not just themselves, but humanity as a whole. True superiority involves lifting others up rather than pushing them down. Adler's approach to therapy emphasizes encouragement and empowerment, rather than dwelling on pathology and problems. This reflects Nietzsche's focus on strength and possibility, rather than weakness and limitation. Adlerian therapists help clients recognize their hidden strengths and develop strategies for overcoming obstacles. They focus on what people can do rather than what they cannot do. This approach anticipates modern positive psychology and strength-based interventions. Both Nietzsche and Adler understood that people grow by building on their assets rather than by eliminating their deficits. The lifestyle assessment, a key Adlerian technique, involves helping clients understand the unconscious patterns that guide their behavior. This reflects Nietzsche's insight that we are largely unknown to ourselves and that psychological growth requires making unconscious patterns conscious. Adler developed specific methods for uncovering these patterns through early memories, family dynamics, and behavioral analysis. The goal is to help people understand how they have been living and to choose whether to continue or change these patterns. This empowers people to become active creators of their lives rather than passive victims of their conditioning. It transforms them from being lived by their unconscious patterns to consciously choosing their direction. Part 9. Master and Slave Mentalities, Psychological Types Formed in Childhood. Nietzsche's analysis of master and slave mentalities represents one of his most penetrating insights into human psychology. These are not social classes, but psychological orientations that develop in early childhood and shape how people approach life throughout their development. Understanding these mentalities helps explain why some people thrive while others struggle, even when they start from similar circumstances. More importantly, it reveals that these orientations can be changed through conscious effort and therapeutic intervention. The master mentality is characterized by an internal locus of control and active engagement with life. People with this orientation believe they can influence their circumstances through their choices and actions. They focus on what they can control rather than what they cannot control. When they encounter obstacles, they ask what they can do differently rather than who is to blame. They derive their sense of worth from their own achievements and growth rather than from comparison with others. They create their own values based on their experience rather than simply inheriting them from authority figures. The slave mentality is characterized by an external locus of control and reactive engagement with life. People with this orientation believe they are primarily victims of circumstances beyond their control. They focus on what others are doing to them rather than what they can do for themselves. When they encounter obstacles, they ask who is to blame rather than what they can learn. They derive their sense of worth from moral superiority or victim status rather than from personal accomplishment. They accept values from authority figures without question or rebel against them without creating alternatives. These psychological orientations typically develop in early childhood based on family dynamics and attachment patterns. Children who are encouraged to explore, make mistakes, and learn from consequences tend to develop master mentality. They learn that they can influence their environment through their actions. Children who are overprotected, criticized, or traumatized tend to develop slave mentality. They learn that the world is dangerous and that they are powerless to protect themselves. These early experiences create unconscious beliefs about self and world that persist into adulthood unless consciously examined and changed. Modern research on attachment theory validates Nietzsche's insights about early psychological formation. Children who develop secure attachment with consistent, responsive caregivers tend to become autonomous, confident adults. Children who experience inconsistent or rejecting caregiving tend to become anxious, dependent, or avoidant adults. These attachment patterns shape fundamental beliefs about whether the self is worthy and whether others can be trusted. They influence everything from career choices to relationship patterns to parenting styles. The good news is that these patterns can be changed through therapeutic work and conscious relationship experiences. In clinical practice, recognizing master and slave mentalities helps therapists understand their clients' core psychological dynamics. Clients with slave mentality often present as victims who feel powerless to change their circumstances. They may have extensive histories of trauma, abuse, or neglect that reinforce their sense of helplessness. The therapeutic task is not to dismiss their pain, but to help them reclaim their power. This requires gradually shifting focus from what happened to them to what they can do now. It involves helping them recognize their strengths and develop strategies for exercising agency in their current life. Clients with master mentality may present differently, often appearing confident and self-directed. However, they may struggle with relationship issues if their self-reliance becomes isolation or their confidence becomes arrogance. They may need to learn how to be vulnerable and interdependent. They may also need to examine whether their values are authentically their own or unconsciously inherited from family or culture. The therapeutic task is to help them integrate their strength with wisdom and compassion. Both types need to find balance between autonomy and connection, self-care and care for others. Part 10. The unconscious mind, we are unknown to ourselves. Nietzsche's exploration of the unconscious mind was revolutionary for his time and remains relevant today. He understood that consciousness represents only a tiny fraction of mental activity and that most of our behavior is driven by forces we do not understand. This insight predated Freud by decades and provided the foundation for all subsequent depth psychology. Understanding how the unconscious operates helps explain why people often act against their conscious intentions and how therapeutic change actually occurs. Nietzsche argued that consciousness evolved as a social tool for communication rather than for self-knowledge. We developed the ability to think in words so we could coordinate with others, not so we could understand ourselves. This means that much of what we call conscious thought is actually a translation of deeper processes into social language. When you think you are making a rational decision, you are often creating a logical story to justify an unconscious choice that has already been made. This explains why people can give elaborate reasons for their behavior that have little relationship to their actual motivations. They are not lying. They genuinely believe their own explanations because consciousness automatically generates plausible narratives. The unconscious mind operates according to different principles than conscious thought. It is driven by desires, emotions, and instincts rather than logic and evidence. It responds to symbols, metaphors, and associations rather than literal meanings. It operates in patterns and habits rather than deliberate choices. It is influenced by early experiences, cultural conditioning, and biological drives that consciousness may never recognize. This is why rational arguments rarely change deep-seated beliefs or behaviors. The unconscious has its own logic that must be understood and respected if change is to occur. You cannot simply think your way out of unconscious patterns. Nietzsche identified several ways that unconscious material reveals itself. Dreams, fantasies, and imaginative productions contain symbolic representations of unconscious conflicts and desires. Slips of the tongue, mistakes, and accidents often express unconscious intentions that consciousness would deny. Repetitive patterns in relationships and behavior reveal unconscious beliefs and expectations. Strong emotional reactions, especially those that seem disproportionate, point to unconscious triggers and unresolved issues. What we hate or love most intensely in others often reflects unconscious aspects of ourselves. Modern neuroscience has confirmed many of Nietzsche's insights about unconscious processing. Brain imaging studies show that most mental activity occurs below the threshold of consciousness. The brain makes decisions before consciousness becomes aware of them. Emotional reactions begin in subcortical regions before reaching cortical areas responsible for conscious thought. Memory, perception, and judgment are all influenced by unconscious biases and associations. This does not mean we are helpless victims of unconscious forces, but it does mean that consciousness is not the driver of behavior that we typically assume it to be. Therapeutic work must engage the unconscious mind if it is to produce lasting change. Simply providing information or teaching coping skills operates only at the conscious level and often fails to address underlying patterns. Effective therapy creates experiences that shift unconscious beliefs and emotional patterns. This might involve reliving and reprocessing traumatic memories, exploring symbolic meanings in dreams and fantasies, or creating new relationship experiences that contradict old assumptions. The goal is not to eliminate the unconscious, but to develop a more collaborative relationship between conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. When these parts of the mind work together, rather than against each other, people experience greater authenticity, creativity, and psychological freedom. Part 11. The Eternal Recurrence, a thought experiment for authentic living. The eternal recurrence represents Nietzsche's most profound psychological test for authentic living. He asked, "What if you had to live your exact same life over and over again for eternity, with every detail repeated exactly as it happened? Would this thought fill you with horror or joy?" This is not a metaphysical claim about how reality actually works, but a powerful therapeutic tool for evaluating whether you are living authentically. The thought experiment works by forcing you to take complete responsibility for your choices. If you knew you would have to repeat every moment of your life forever, you would think very carefully about how you spend your time. You would eliminate activities that bring no genuine satisfaction. You would avoid relationships that drain your energy without providing real connection. You would stop pursuing goals that come from social pressure rather than authentic desire. You would focus on creating moments you would genuinely want to experience again and again. Most people initially react to the eternal recurrence with dread because they realize how much of their life they would not want to repeat. They see how much time they waste on meaningless activities, toxic relationships, and pursuits that bring no real fulfillment. They recognize how often they live according to other people's expectations rather than their own values. They become aware of how much they procrastinate on what really matters while obsessing over trivial concerns. This initial horror is actually therapeutic because it motivates authentic change. When you truly accept that this is your one life, you start taking it seriously. The goal is to gradually transform your relationship to the eternal recurrence from horror to affirmation. This happens as you align your life more closely with your authentic values and desires. You begin making choices based on what brings genuine satisfaction rather than what you think you should do. You start saying no to activities and people that drain your energy and yes to those that energize you. You focus on developing your unique gifts rather than trying to be someone you are not. You learn to find meaning in ordinary moments rather than waiting for extraordinary events. Modern psychology has validated the therapeutic power of this type of reflection. Research on mortality salience shows that thinking about death motivates people to live more authentically. Studies on life review reveal that people who regularly reflect on their choices make better decisions. The practice of memento mori, remembering that you will die, has been used therapeutically for centuries. Nietzsche's eternal recurrence takes this further by asking not just whether you are prepared to die, but whether you are prepared to live the same life forever. This creates even more motivation for authentic change. Practical application involves regular self-examination using the eternal recurrence test. At the end of each day, ask yourself, would I want to live this day again? If the answer is no, examine what needs to change. Are you spending time on activities that do not align with your values? Are you in relationships that do not nourish your soul? Are you pursuing goals that come from external pressure rather than internal motivation? Use these insights to make gradual adjustments that move your life in a more authentic direction. The goal is not perfection, but continuous movement toward a life you would genuinely want to repeat forever. Part 12. Nietzschean Therapy Techniques in Modern Practice. Contemporary therapists are increasingly recognizing the value of Nietzschean insights and developing specific techniques based on his psychological principles. These approaches focus on empowerment, creativity, and value creation rather than just symptom reduction. They emphasize strength building over deficit correction and encourage clients to become active creators of their lives rather than passive victims of their circumstances. Understanding these techniques gives both therapists and clients powerful tools for psychological transformation. One key technique is values clarification through genealogical analysis. This involves helping clients trace the origins of their beliefs and values to determine which ones are authentically theirs versus inherited from family, culture, or society. The therapist asks questions like, where did this belief come from? Does this value still serve you, or is it a remnant from your past? If you could create your own moral code from scratch, what would it include? This process helps clients distinguish between inherited shoulds and authentic wants, leading to more self-directed living. Another powerful technique is reframing suffering as a source of strength rather than simply a problem to be eliminated. Instead of focusing only on reducing symptoms, Nietzschean therapy helps clients discover how their struggles have contributed to their growth. The therapist might ask, how has this experience made you stronger? What qualities have you developed that you might not have otherwise? How might this difficulty be preparing you for something important? This approach validates the client's pain while simultaneously revealing its transformative potential. Perspective-taking exercises help clients develop what Nietzsche called Perspectivism, the ability to see situations from multiple viewpoints. When clients are stuck in rigid thinking patterns, therapists guide them through exercises that reveal alternative interpretations. They might ask, how would your best friend view this situation? What would you tell someone else facing the same challenge? How might this look completely different in 5 years? This flexibility of perspective reduces emotional reactivity and increases creative problem-solving capacity. Creative expression becomes a therapeutic tool rather than just an enjoyable activity. Nietzschean therapy encourages clients to express their authentic selves through art, writing, music, or other creative mediums. This serves multiple functions. It provides access to unconscious material, develops self-knowledge, builds confidence, and creates meaning. The focus is not on artistic quality, but on authentic expression. Clients learn to use creativity as a way of processing emotions, exploring identity, and envisioning new possibilities for their lives. They become artists of their own existence. Power analysis helps clients recognize where they are giving away their power and how to reclaim it. The therapist helps identify patterns where the client adopts victim stance instead of taking action. They explore questions like, where in your life do you feel powerless? What would it look like to take responsibility here? How are you contributing to situations you complain about? This is not about blaming the client, but about empowering them to recognize their agency even in difficult circumstances. Future self-visualization involves imagining the person you could become if you fully developed your potential. Clients are guided to envision their highest possible self and then work backward to identify steps needed to get there. This technique motivates change by connecting present actions to future identity. It helps clients see beyond current limitations to recognize untapped possibilities. The focus shifts from fixing what is wrong to creating what could be right. This approach naturally generates hope and motivation for growth. Part 13. The Psychology of Creativity and Self-Creation. Nietzsche understood that humans are fundamentally creative beings who have the capacity to shape their own character and destiny. This was revolutionary thinking in an era dominated by religious and scientific determinism. He argued that we are not fixed entities with predetermined natures, but ongoing projects of self-creation. Understanding the psychology of this creative process helps explain how people can transform themselves and provides practical tools for intentional personal development. The creative process begins with destruction or deconstruction of existing patterns. Before you can create something new, you must be willing to let go of what no longer serves you. This might involve questioning beliefs you inherited from family, leaving relationships that limit your growth, or abandoning career paths that do not align with your values. This destructive phase is often uncomfortable because it involves uncertainty and loss of familiar structure. However, it is necessary for creative breakthrough because you cannot build something genuinely new on a foundation of old assumptions. Destruction clears space for creation. The second phase involves experimentation and play. Once you have cleared away old patterns, you need to try new ways of being without knowing in advance what will work. This requires what Nietzsche called intellectual courage, the willingness to risk being wrong or appearing foolish. You might experiment with new forms of expression, different social roles, or alternative belief systems. The key is to approach this experimentation with curiosity rather than attachment to outcomes. You are gathering data about what resonates with your authentic self rather than trying to force predetermined results. The third phase involves integration and commitment. After experimenting with various possibilities, you gradually discover which new patterns feel authentic and sustainable. You begin committing to these new ways of being and developing them more fully. This requires discipline and persistence because creating new habits and identity patterns takes time and repeated practice. You must be willing to invest energy in developing your emerging self even when external rewards are not immediately apparent. This is where many people fail because they give up before new patterns become established. Modern research on neuroplasticity confirms that the brain remains capable of significant change throughout life. New neural pathways can be created through conscious practice and repetition. This means that personality, habits, and even deep-seated beliefs can be altered through intentional effort. Studies on identity formation show that people who actively engage in self-reflection and conscious choice-making develop stronger, more coherent identities. Research on creativity reveals that innovative thinking requires both divergent thinking that generates possibilities and convergent thinking that evaluates and selects among options. Nietzsche's model of self-creation incorporates both processes. Practical application involves treating your life as an ongoing creative project. Regularly ask yourself, what aspects of my current identity no longer serve me? What new qualities would I like to develop? What experiments could I try to explore these possibilities? Approach this work with the same seriousness and dedication that an artist brings to their craft. Set aside time for self-reflection, experimentation and practice. Document your progress and learning so you can build on what works. Remember that becoming who you are is a lifelong process rather than a destination. The ultimate goal is what Nietzsche called becoming who you are. This does not mean discovering some predetermined essence, but rather actively creating an authentic self through conscious choice and commitment. It means taking responsibility for shaping your character rather than simply accepting whatever patterns you inherited or developed unconsciously. It means becoming the author of your own story rather than just a character in someone else's narrative. This is simultaneously the most challenging and most rewarding work any human being can undertake. It transforms you from a passive recipient of life to an active creator of meaning and value. Part 14. Nihilism and the Meaning Crisis in Modern Society. Nietzsche predicted that the death of traditional religious and moral authorities would lead to a crisis of meaning that he called nihilism. This is the experience of life as fundamentally meaningless, where nothing seems to matter and all values appear arbitrary. Modern society is experiencing exactly this crisis as increasing numbers of people report feeling empty, directionless and disconnected from purpose. Understanding the psychology of nihilism and its remedies is essential for both individual mental health and social well-being. Nihilism develops when people lose faith in transcendent sources of meaning without developing alternative foundations for value and purpose. Traditional religion provided clear answers about why life matters and how to live well. When these beliefs become untenable for many people, they face an existential vacuum that often manifests as depression, anxiety, addiction, or despair. The nihilistic person concludes that if there is no God or objective moral order, then nothing ultimately matters. They experience what psychologists call learned helplessness on a cosmic scale. Their actions feel meaningless because they lack a larger framework that gives them significance. Modern manifestations of nihilism include the epidemic of depression and anxiety among young people, increasing rates of suicide and self-harm, widespread addiction to substances and behaviors, political apathy and cynicism, and the pursuit of shallow pleasures as distractions from emptiness. Social media amplifies nihilistic tendencies by creating constant comparison with others and reducing human connection to superficial interactions. Consumer culture promises meaning through material acquisition, but delivers only temporary satisfaction. The result is a generation of people who have access to unprecedented material comfort, but lack existential grounding. Nietzsche understood that nihilism is both a danger and an opportunity. It is dangerous because it can lead to despair, destructiveness, and the abandonment of all values. However, it is also necessary because it clears away false or inadequate sources of meaning to make room for more authentic ones. The person who has gone through nihilism and emerged on the other side is stronger than someone who has never questioned their inherited beliefs. They have developed the capacity to create meaning rather than simply consuming it from external sources. They become what Nietzsche called free spirits, who can live without the crutch of absolute certainty. The therapeutic response to nihilism involves helping people create meaningful lives without relying on external authorities. This requires developing what existential therapists call authentic existence, where people take responsibility for choosing their own values and purposes. It involves learning to find meaning in the process of living rather than in some final destination or reward. People learn to create value through their choices, relationships, and contributions rather than discovering it in some predetermined cosmic plan. Practical strategies for overcoming nihilism include developing personal values through reflection and experimentation rather than inheritance. Engage in activities that provide intrinsic satisfaction rather than external rewards. Build deep relationships based on genuine connection rather than superficial interaction. Contribute to something larger than yourself through work volunteering or creative expression. Practice gratitude and mindfulness to appreciate the inherent value of ordinary experiences. Accept uncertainty and ambiguity as natural aspects of human existence rather than problems to be solved. The ultimate antidote to nihilism is learning to say yes to life despite its difficulties and uncertainties. This requires developing emotional resilience, intellectual courage, and creative capacity. It means embracing the responsibility of creating meaning rather than waiting for it to be provided by external sources. When people learn to do this successfully, they often report greater life satisfaction than those who rely on traditional sources of meaning. They become psychologically self-sufficient and emotionally resilient. They transform from meaning seekers to meaning makers. Part 15. The herd mentality in social media and cancel culture. Nietzsche's analysis of herd mentality provides crucial insights into contemporary social media dynamics and cancel culture phenomena. He understood that most people prefer the safety and comfort of group conformity to the uncertainty and responsibility of independent thinking. Social media amplifies these tendencies by creating digital herds that enforce conformity through likes, shares, and social sanctions. Understanding these psychological mechanisms helps explain current social pathologies and provides tools for maintaining individual authenticity in a conformist culture. The herd mentality develops as a survival strategy that prioritizes group acceptance over individual authenticity. Throughout human history, being excluded from the group often meant death, so we evolved powerful psychological mechanisms that make us highly sensitive to social approval and disapproval. These mechanisms served us well in small tribal societies, but become problematic in large, anonymous social media environments. The same psychological drives that once kept us safe now make us vulnerable to mob dynamics and groupthink. Social media platforms exploit these psychological vulnerabilities by providing immediate feedback about social acceptance. Every post receives measurable responses in the form of likes, comments, and shares. This creates an addictive cycle where people modify their behavior to maximize positive responses rather than expressing their authentic thoughts and feelings. They learn to self-censor opinions that might be unpopular and amplify those that generate approval. Over time, they lose touch with their own authentic voice and become performers playing to an audience. They sacrifice individuality for viral success. Cancel culture represents an extreme manifestation of herd enforcement mechanisms. When someone violates group norms or expresses unpopular opinions, the digital mob mobilizes to punish them through public shaming, professional consequences, and social isolation. This serves the psychological function of reinforcing group boundaries and demonstrating the costs of nonconformity. However, it also creates a climate of fear that discourages independent thinking and authentic expression. People learn to think twice before sharing their real thoughts, leading to self-censorship and intellectual conformity. The result is a culture of superficial agreement that masks genuine diversity of thought and feeling. Nietzsche predicted that herd dominance would lead to mediocrity and stagnation because groups tend toward the lowest common denominator. When everyone must agree, only the most obvious and least challenging ideas survive. Innovation and creativity require the willingness to think differently. But herd mentality punishes differentness. The result is intellectual and cultural flattening, where unique perspectives are suppressed in favor of safe consensus. This explains why so much social media content feels repetitive and superficial, despite involving millions of participants. The medium rewards conformity and punishes originality. Developing immunity to herd mentality requires conscious cultivation of what Nietzsche called intellectual courage. This means learning to think for yourself even when your conclusions differ from popular opinion. It involves developing internal sources of validation rather than depending entirely on external approval. Practice expressing your authentic thoughts and feelings even when they might be unpopular. Cultivate relationships with people who value honesty over agreement and encourage independent thinking. Learn to tolerate uncertainty and ambiguity rather than rushing to join group consensus. Practical strategies include limiting social media exposure to reduce psychological pressure for conformity. When you do use these platforms, focus on creating content that reflects your authentic interests and values rather than what you think will be popular. Diversify your information sources to expose yourself to different perspectives and avoid echo chambers. Practice disagree without being disagreeable, learning to express different opinions respectfully. Remember that your worth as a person does not depend on social media metrics or group approval. Develop confidence in your own judgment through independent thinking and personal reflection. Part 16. Psychological health versus moral health. Nietzsche made a revolutionary distinction between psychological health and moral health that challenges conventional therapeutic approaches. He argued that what society considers morally good may actually be psychologically harmful, while what appears immoral might sometimes be psychologically necessary. This insight forces us to examine whether our pursuit of moral virtue is supporting or undermining our psychological well-being. Understanding this distinction helps both therapists and clients navigate complex ethical questions in therapeutic work. Traditional morality often demands self-sacrifice, humility, and the suppression of natural desires. While these qualities can contribute to social harmony, they may come at the cost of individual psychological health. The person who constantly puts others' needs before their own may appear virtuous, but often develops resentment, burnout, and loss of authentic self. The person who never expresses anger may seem peaceful, but often suffers from depression and passive-aggressive behavior. The person who follows all the rules may appear good, but often lacks creativity, spontaneity, and genuine joy. Moral compliance can become a form of psychological prison. Psychological health, in contrast, requires authenticity, self-expression, and the integration of all aspects of personality, including those society considers negative. A psychologically healthy person can access and express anger when appropriate, pursue their own interests without excessive guilt, and challenge authority when necessary. They can be selfish in the healthy sense of taking care of their own needs so they can genuinely care for others. They can be aggressive in the positive sense of assertively pursuing their goals and protecting their boundaries. They integrate their shadow aspects rather than repressing them entirely. This may sometimes conflict with conventional moral expectations. The therapeutic implications are significant. Sometimes clients need permission to be less moral in the conventional sense in order to become more psychologically healthy. A people pleaser may need to learn selfishness. A passive person may need to develop healthy aggression. A guilt-ridden person may need to embrace their desires. A submissive person may need to challenge authority. This does not mean encouraging destructive or harmful behavior, but it does mean recognizing that psychological health sometimes requires acting against social expectations. The goal is authentic self-expression rather than moral performance. Modern research supports the distinction between psychological and moral health. Studies show that people who are overly concerned with appearing moral often suffer from higher rates of anxiety, depression, and relationship problems. Research on authenticity reveals that people who express their genuine thoughts and feelings have better mental health outcomes than those who constantly conform to social expectations. Studies on assertiveness training demonstrate that learning to express needs and set boundaries improves psychological well-being, even when it creates social friction. This perspective does not advocate for abandoning all moral considerations, but rather for developing a more nuanced understanding of ethics. True morality should support rather than undermine human flourishing. When moral systems consistently produce psychological damage, they need to be questioned and revised. The goal is to find ways of living that honor both individual authenticity and social responsibility. This requires moving beyond rigid moral rules to develop ethical wisdom that can navigate complex situations. It means becoming moral agents rather than moral followers. Practical application involves regularly examining whether your moral beliefs and behaviors support or undermine your psychological well-being. Ask yourself, do my values bring me genuine satisfaction, or do they feel like burdens? Am I being good because it feels authentic or because I fear disapproval? Are there areas where I need to be less moral in the conventional sense to be more psychologically healthy? This examination should be done with wisdom and consideration for others, but it should also prioritize your own authenticity and well-being. Remember that taking care of yourself is not selfish, but necessary for genuine care of others. Part 17. The Role of Suffering in Psychological Growth. Nietzsche's understanding of suffering as a necessary ingredient in psychological development challenges modern tendencies to eliminate all pain and discomfort. He argued that the attempt to avoid suffering often prevents the growth that comes from working through difficult experiences. This does not mean seeking out unnecessary pain, but rather recognizing that some suffering is inevitable and can be transformative when approached with the right attitude. Understanding the psychology of productive suffering helps distinguish between pain that heals and pain that merely hurts. There are different types of suffering with different psychological functions. Some suffering is pointless and destructive, such as abuse, trauma and oppression that overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. This type of suffering typically needs to be ended, escaped or healed rather than embraced. However, other types of suffering serve important developmental functions. The suffering that comes from growth, challenge and change often catalyzes psychological development that would not occur otherwise. This includes the discomfort of learning new skills, the anxiety of taking risks, and the grief of letting go of outgrown patterns. Growth-promoting suffering typically has several characteristics. First, it is chosen or at least accepted rather than imposed against the person's will. Second, it is time-limited with a clear purpose, rather than endless and meaningless. Third, it leads to increased capacity, wisdom or strength, rather than just depletion. Fourth, it connects the person to larger meaning and purpose rather than isolating them in private misery. When suffering has these qualities, it can be truly transformative. Modern psychology recognizes this distinction in concepts like post-traumatic growth, where people report positive changes following difficult experiences. Research shows that many individuals develop increased resilience, deeper relationships, greater appreciation for life, spiritual growth and recognition of personal strength after surviving significant challenges. However, this growth is not automatic but depends on how people interpret and integrate their experiences. Those who find meaning in their suffering are more likely to benefit from it than those who remain focused only on the pain. The therapeutic approach to suffering involves helping clients distinguish between productive and unproductive pain. Unproductive pain should be reduced through appropriate interventions including medication, trauma therapy or environmental changes. Productive pain should be supported and given meaning so it can fulfill its developmental function. This might involve reframing challenges as opportunities for growth, identifying strengths that emerge from difficulties, or connecting personal struggles to larger purposes. The goal is not to eliminate all suffering, but to ensure that unavoidable suffering serves constructive purposes. This transforms people from victims of their pain to beneficiaries of their strength. Nietzsche's concept of Amor Fati, loving one's fate, represents the ultimate therapeutic relationship to suffering. This involves learning to appreciate how difficult experiences have contributed to personal development and character formation. It means recognizing that the person you have become includes both your joys and your sorrows. Without the challenges you have faced, you would be a different and possibly less developed person. This perspective does not glorify suffering, but honors its role in creating strength, wisdom and compassion. It transforms past pain from pure liability into psychological asset. Practical application involves developing a more sophisticated relationship to discomfort and difficulty. When facing challenges, ask yourself, what might this experience teach me? How could this difficulty contribute to my growth? What strengths might I develop by working through this situation? This does not mean being grateful for all suffering, but rather looking for opportunities to extract value from inevitable pain. Learn to distinguish between suffering that serves growth and suffering that merely depletes. Minimize the latter while finding meaning in the former. Remember that avoiding all discomfort often prevents the development of resilience and strength. Part 18. Perspectivism, understanding multiple viewpoints. Nietzsche's theory of perspectivism holds that there are no absolute truths, only interpretations from particular viewpoints. This does not mean that all perspectives are equally valid, but that every viewpoint is limited and partial. Understanding perspectivism helps develop psychological flexibility and reduces the tendency toward rigid thinking that often underlies emotional distress. This insight has profound implications for therapy, relationships, and personal development. Perspectivism emerges from recognizing that all knowledge is shaped by the knower's position, background, and interests. A rich person and a poor person will see economic systems very differently. A parent and a child will interpret family dynamics from contrasting viewpoints. A person who has suffered trauma will perceive the world differently than someone who has not. Each perspective contains partial truths while missing others. The goal is not to find the one correct viewpoint, but to appreciate the complexity that emerges from multiple perspectives. Psychological problems often involve getting stuck in a single perspective that no longer serves the person's well-being. Depression typically involves seeing only negative aspects of situations while being blind to positive possibilities. Anxiety involves focusing exclusively on potential threats while ignoring evidence of safety. Anger involves interpreting others' actions as deliberately harmful while missing innocent explanations. Rigid thinking patterns trap people in limited perspectives that generate unnecessary suffering. Therapeutic change often involves helping people develop alternative viewpoints that reveal new possibilities for understanding and action. Perspective-taking skills can be deliberately developed through specific practices. When facing a difficult situation, consciously ask yourself, how would someone else view this? What would my best friend say about this situation? How might this look completely different in 5 years? What would I tell someone else facing the same challenge? What positive interpretation could explain what happened? These questions help break rigid thinking patterns and reveal alternative ways of understanding experiences. They create psychological flexibility that reduces emotional reactivity and increases creative problem-solving. Perspectivism also applies to understanding other people. Instead of assuming that others think and feel the same way you do, recognize that they operate from different perspectives shaped by their unique experiences. The behavior that seems obviously wrong to you might make perfect sense from their viewpoint. This does not mean accepting harmful behavior, but rather understanding its psychological logic. This understanding often reduces interpersonal conflict and increases empathy and compassion. It helps you respond to the person behind the behavior rather than just reacting to the surface actions. In relationships, perspectivism helps resolve conflicts by revealing how both parties can be partially right from their own viewpoints. Instead of fighting about who is correct, couples can explore how their different perspectives create misunderstanding. They can learn to appreciate the validity of each other's viewpoints while working toward shared understanding. This approach transforms adversarial relationships into collaborative ones where differences become sources of learning rather than conflict. Developing perspectival thinking also involves recognizing the limitations of your own viewpoint. Ask yourself, what might I be missing from my current perspective? What biases might be shaping my interpretation? How might someone who disagrees with me explain their position? This intellectual humility prevents dogmatism and keeps you open to new information and alternative possibilities. It develops wisdom that recognizes the complexity of human experience while avoiding relativism that claims all viewpoints are equally valid. Some perspectives are more accurate, helpful, or ethical than others, but all are limited and partial. The goal is to develop increasingly accurate and useful perspectives while remaining open to revision based on new evidence and experience. Part 19. The Psychology of Values and Value Creation. Nietzsche revolutionized thinking about values by arguing that they are human creations rather than eternal truths discovered through reason or revelation. This means that people have both the opportunity and responsibility to create values that support human flourishing. Understanding the psychology of value creation helps explain why people become confused about right and wrong and provides tools for developing authentic personal ethics. This insight transforms moral questions from matters of compliance to opportunities for creative responsibility. Values emerge from human needs, desires and social arrangements rather than from abstract principles. The value placed on honesty emerges from the human need for trust and cooperation. The value placed on courage emerges from the necessity of facing danger and uncertainty. The value placed on compassion emerges from the recognition of shared vulnerability and interdependence. Understanding these psychological roots helps distinguish between values that serve human flourishing and those that do not. It also reveals why values can legitimately differ based on circumstances and cultural context. Many psychological problems stem from conflicts between inherited values and personal experience. Someone raised to believe that expressing anger is always wrong may struggle with depression because they cannot access their natural assertiveness. Someone taught that success requires ruthless competition may feel empty despite achieving external recognition. Someone convinced that self-sacrifice is the highest virtue may become resentful and burned out. These conflicts create internal dissonance that manifests as anxiety, depression, or relationship problems. Resolution requires examining inherited values to determine which ones still serve authentic needs and which ones need to be modified or replaced. The process of value creation involves several steps. First, identify your core needs and desires rather than what you think you should want. Second, examine how your current values support or conflict with these authentic needs. Third, experiment with alternative values that might better serve your well-being. Fourth, test these new values through action to see how they work in practice. Fifth, refine and commit to values that prove helpful while remaining open to further revision. This is an ongoing process rather than a one-time decision because needs and circumstances change over time. Values must evolve to remain relevant and useful. Value creation is both an individual and social process. While personal values must align with individual needs and temperament, they also must function within social relationships and cultural contexts. The challenge is to create values that honor both authenticity and responsibility. This requires ongoing negotiation between personal desires and social obligations. The goal is not pure individualism that ignores others' needs, nor pure conformity that ignores personal authenticity. Mature value creation finds ways to serve both self and others through creative synthesis. Modern research on moral psychology supports Nietzsche's insights about value creation. Studies show that people who actively examine and choose their values report higher life satisfaction than those who simply inherit them from family or culture. Research on intrinsic motivation reveals that behavior driven by personally meaningful values is more sustainable than behavior driven by external rewards or punishments. Studies on moral development show that the highest stages involve principled reasoning that can critique and revise conventional moral standards. Practical value creation involves regular reflection on what matters most to you and why. Ask yourself, which of my current values feel authentic versus inherited? What values would I choose if I were starting fresh? How do my values serve my well-being and the well-being of others? Where do I need to develop new values to address current life challenges? Remember that creating values is an ongoing responsibility rather than a one-time task. As you grow and change, your values may need to evolve as well. The goal is to become a conscious creator of your moral framework rather than a passive inheritor of others' standards. Part 20. Authentic Self versus Social Self. One of Nietzsche's most important psychological insights involves the distinction between authentic self and social self. The social self is the persona we develop to gain acceptance and function in society, while the authentic self is our genuine nature stripped of social conditioning. Many psychological problems arise from over-identification with the social self at the expense of authentic self-expression. Understanding this distinction is crucial for achieving psychological integration and genuine satisfaction. The social self develops early in childhood as we learn what behaviors gain approval and avoid punishment. Children quickly discover that certain aspects of their personality are welcomed while others are rejected or criticized. They learn to emphasize socially acceptable traits while suppressing or hiding those that create conflict. Over time, this social persona can become so dominant that people lose touch with their authentic nature. They become skilled performers playing roles rather than genuine individuals expressing their truth. This split creates internal tension that often manifests as anxiety, depression, or a sense of emptiness. The authentic self includes all aspects of personality, including those that society might consider negative or inappropriate. It encompasses natural desires, spontaneous emotions, creative impulses, and individual quirks that make each person unique. The authentic self is often messy, contradictory, and difficult to categorize because it has not been edited for social consumption. It may include anger, sexuality, ambition, vulnerability, and other qualities that the social self learns to hide or modify. Integration requires learning to express these authentic aspects in appropriate ways, rather than suppressing them entirely. This does not mean acting on every impulse, but rather acknowledging and honoring all parts of yourself. The conflict between authentic and social self often intensifies during transitions and life crises. People may find themselves successful by external standards but feeling empty or unfulfilled internally. They may have devoted so much energy to maintaining their social persona that they have lost connection with their authentic desires and values. This often triggers what psychologists call identity crisis, where people question who they really are beneath their social roles. These crises, while uncomfortable, often provide opportunities for greater authenticity and integration. They force people to examine whether their current life aligns with their genuine nature. Therapeutic work often involves helping clients distinguish between authentic and social aspects of their identity. This requires creating safe space where people can explore parts of themselves they have learned to hide or deny. It involves examining family and cultural messages about what is acceptable and questioning whether these standards still serve the person's well-being. The goal is not to eliminate the social self, which serves important functions, but to ensure that it does not completely overshadow authentic self-expression. Healthy people can access both social and authentic aspects as appropriate to different situations. They can be professional at work and playful at home, serious in some contexts and spontaneous in others. Modern research validates the importance of authenticity for psychological well-being. Studies show that people who report living authentically have lower rates of depression and anxiety and higher life satisfaction. Research on role conflict demonstrates that excessive gap between public and private self creates psychological strain. Studies on self-concept clarity reveal that people with coherent, stable identities cope better with stress and make better decisions. This research confirms Nietzsche's insight that psychological health requires integration of different aspects of personality rather than rigid separation. The goal is authentic wholeness rather than fragmented performance. Practical integration involves regularly checking whether your external life aligns with your internal truth. Ask yourself, am I being genuine in my relationships and work? What aspects of myself do I feel I must hide to be accepted? How can I express more of my authentic nature while still maintaining important relationships and responsibilities? Start small by sharing more genuine thoughts and feelings with trusted people. Notice when you are performing versus when you're being authentic. Gradually expand the contexts where you feel safe to be genuine. Remember that authenticity is not about being completely unfiltered, but about ensuring that your essential nature can find expression in your life. Part 21. The Death of God and Psychological Independence. Nietzsche's famous declaration that God is dead was not a theological claim, but a psychological observation about the collapse of traditional sources of meaning and authority. He recognized that increasing numbers of people could no longer rely on religious institutions to provide life direction and moral guidance. This creates both crisis and opportunity. Crisis, because people lose familiar frameworks for understanding their purpose, and opportunity because they must develop psychological independence and self-direction. Understanding this transition helps explain many contemporary mental health issues and points towards solutions. The death of God represents the death of any external authority that previously provided unquestionable answers about how to live. This includes not only religious institutions, but also rigid political ideologies, absolute moral systems, and cultural traditions that once gave people clear roles and expectations. When these external guides lose their power, people face what existentialists call the burden of freedom, the responsibility to choose their own direction without guarantees. This can be terrifying for those accustomed to external guidance, but liberating for those ready to take responsibility for their own lives. The psychological impact of this transition often manifests as existential anxiety, depression, or nihilism. People may feel overwhelmed by too many choices, or paralyzed by uncertainty about what is right. They may experience what psychologists call decision fatigue, from constantly having to make choices that were previously made by tradition or authority. Some people respond by clinging more desperately to religious or political certainties, while others drift into relativism where nothing seems to matter. Both responses avoid the challenging but ultimately liberating work of developing personal authority and authentic values. They represent attempts to escape freedom rather than embrace it. Psychological independence requires developing internal sources of guidance to replace external authorities. This involves learning to trust your own judgment while remaining open to input from others. It means developing personal values through reflection and experience rather than simply inheriting them. It requires building confidence in your ability to navigate uncertainty and ambiguity without needing absolute answers. Most importantly, it involves accepting responsibility for the consequences of your choices, rather than blaming external circumstances or authorities. This is difficult work that many people avoid, but it leads to genuine empowerment and authenticity. The therapeutic process often involves helping clients move from external to internal locus of control. This means shifting from asking what others expect to asking what feels authentic and meaningful. It involves developing tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity rather than seeking false certainties. Clients learn to make decisions based on their own values and judgment while considering input from others. They develop confidence in their ability to handle whatever consequences arise from their choices. This creates genuine self-reliance that is not dependent on external validation or guidance. The death of God also creates space for what Nietzsche called self-deification, not in the sense of grandiose narcissism, but in the sense of taking ultimate responsibility for creating meaning and purpose in your life. Instead of waiting for external sources to tell you what your life should mean, you become the author of your own significance. This involves recognizing that meaning is created through choice and commitment, rather than discovered through revelation or reason. You choose what matters to you and then live in accordance with those choices. This transforms you from a dependent follower to an independent creator of value and meaning. It is both the most challenging and most rewarding aspect of psychological maturity. Practical development of psychological independence involves gradually taking more responsibility for major life decisions. Start by questioning inherited beliefs and values to determine which ones still serve you. Practice making choices based on your own judgment rather than seeking approval from others. Develop tolerance for uncertainty by making decisions with incomplete information. Learn from your mistakes rather than avoiding all risk. Build confidence through successfully handling challenges independently. Remember that independence does not mean isolation. You can remain connected to others while maintaining personal autonomy. The goal is psychological self-reliance that enhances rather than replaces meaningful relationships. Part 22. Power Dynamics in Relationships. Nietzsche's insights about power illuminate the hidden dynamics that shape all human relationships. He understood that every interaction involves questions of influence, control and autonomy that are often unconscious but always present. These power dynamics can be healthy when they involve mutual empowerment and growth, or unhealthy when they involve domination and submission. Understanding relationship power helps explain why some connections energize us, while others drain us, and provides tools for creating more balanced and fulfilling interactions. Power in relationships is not primarily about obvious forms of control like physical force or economic dominance. It more often operates through subtle psychological mechanisms such as guilt, shame, dependency, and emotional manipulation. The partner who consistently plays victim may actually be controlling the relationship by making others feel responsible for their emotional state. The person who gives excessive amounts may be creating dependence that serves their need to feel needed. The individual who appears selfless may be using virtue as a form of moral superiority that controls others through guilt. These unconscious power games often destroy the very connection they are meant to secure. Healthy power dynamics in relationships involve what Nietzsche might call mutual empowerment. Both people support each other's growth and autonomy rather than trying to control or diminish the other. They can be strong without making their partner weak, and vulnerable without making their partner responsible for their emotional state. They encourage each other's individual development, even when it creates temporary challenges for the relationship. They share influence and decision-making in ways that honor both people's needs and preferences. This requires emotional maturity and secure attachment that can tolerate the uncertainty of genuine partnership. Many relationship problems stem from unconscious attempts to gain power through weakness rather than strength. The person who cannot say no directly may become passive-aggressive. The individual who fears abandonment may become clingy and controlling. The partner who feels inadequate may criticize the other to level the playing field. These strategies often work temporarily, but ultimately create resentment and distance. They represent misdirected expressions of the will to power that need to be recognized and redirected toward healthier channels. Therapeutic work with couples often involves helping both partners recognize their unconscious power strategies and develop more direct and honest ways of meeting their needs. This requires helping each person develop sufficient self-worth that they do not need to diminish their partner to feel good about themselves. It involves teaching communication skills that allow for direct expression of needs and concerns rather than indirect manipulation. Partners learn to negotiate differences openly rather than using covert tactics to get their way. They develop the capacity to be influenced by each other without losing their individual autonomy. This creates relationships based on choice rather than compulsion, connection rather than control. Power dynamics also appear in family relationships, friendships, and professional interactions. The parent who makes their child responsible for their emotional well-being is misusing power. The friend who only contacts you when they need something is exploiting the relationship. The boss who uses fear and intimidation rather than inspiration and support is demonstrating insecure power. Recognizing these patterns helps you protect yourself from exploitation, while also examining your own potentially problematic power behaviors. The goal is to use whatever power you have in service of growth and connection rather than domination and control. Developing healthy relationship power involves building genuine self-confidence that does not depend on controlling others. This means learning to meet your own emotional needs while still enjoying connection with others. It involves developing direct communication skills so you can ask for what you want rather than manipulating to get it. Learn to recognize when you are trying to control others and redirect that energy towards self-improvement. Support others' growth and autonomy even when it challenges your own preferences. Remember that true power in relationships comes from the ability to love and be loved freely, rather than from the ability to control and be controlled. Part 23. The Psychology of Revenge and Forgiveness. Nietzsche's analysis of revenge and forgiveness reveals the complex psychological dynamics behind these fundamental human responses to injury. He understood that the desire for revenge is natural and often serves important psychological functions, while forgiveness can be either genuine healing or disguised weakness. This nuanced perspective helps explain why simplistic advice to just forgive often fails and provides guidance for working through resentment in healthier ways. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for both personal healing and healthy relationships. The impulse for revenge emerges from the need to restore psychological equilibrium after being harmed. When someone hurts us, it creates an imbalance where they have taken something from us through their actions. The desire for revenge represents an attempt to restore balance by ensuring that they experience consequences for their behavior. This impulse is not necessarily pathological, but can serve important functions such as deterring future harm and preserving self-respect. However, revenge becomes problematic when it consumes the person or when it is disproportionate to the original injury. The challenge is finding ways to restore balance without being destroyed by the process. Nietzsche distinguished between active and reactive responses to injury. Active responses involve taking constructive action to address the situation, protect yourself, or prevent future harm. This might include setting boundaries, ending harmful relationships, pursuing legal remedies, or using the experience as motivation for personal growth. These responses restore power and dignity while moving the person forward. Reactive responses involve rumination, resentment, and fantasies of revenge that keep the person psychologically tied to the injury. These responses often cause more damage to the injured party than to the original perpetrator. True forgiveness, in Nietzsche's view, comes from a position of strength rather than weakness. It occurs when someone no longer needs revenge because they have recovered their sense of power and worth through other means. This type of forgiveness is chosen freely rather than imposed by moral obligation or social pressure. It represents psychological freedom from the past rather than continued bondage to it. False forgiveness, by contrast, often masks continued resentment or represents a strategy to avoid conflict and maintain relationships. This type of forgiveness does not heal the underlying wound and often leads to passive-aggressive behavior or recurring conflicts. The process of genuine forgiveness typically involves several stages. First, the injured person must fully acknowledge the harm that was done without minimizing or excusing it. Second, they must experience and express their natural anger and hurt rather than suppressing these emotions. Third, they must take appropriate action to protect themselves and restore their sense of agency. Fourth, they must find ways to extract meaning and growth from the experience. Finally, they choose to release resentment not as a gift to the perpetrator, but as a gift to themselves. This process cannot be rushed or forced, but must unfold naturally as the person heals. Premature forgiveness often prevents rather than promotes healing. Modern research supports Nietzsche's insights about the complexity of forgiveness. Studies show that genuine forgiveness is associated with better mental and physical health outcomes, but false or premature forgiveness can actually increase psychological distress. Research reveals that people who suppress anger without processing it often develop depression, anxiety, and relationship problems. Studies on post-traumatic growth demonstrate that people who find meaning in their suffering often naturally release resentment as part of their healing process. Practical application involves learning to distinguish between healthy and unhealthy responses to injury. When someone hurts you, first ensure your safety and take any necessary protective action. Allow yourself to feel angry or hurt without immediately trying to forgive. Express these feelings in safe ways, such as writing, talking to trusted friends, or working with a therapist. Consider what actions might help restore your sense of power and dignity. Look for ways to grow stronger or wiser from the experience. Only then consider whether forgiveness serves your well-being. Remember that forgiveness is for your benefit, not for the benefit of those who harmed you. Part 24. Intellectual Honesty and Self-Examination. Nietzsche considered intellectual honesty to be one of the highest virtues and a prerequisite for psychological growth. This involves the courage to examine your own beliefs, motivations, and behaviors without self-deception or defensive rationalization. Most people engage in elaborate mental gymnastics to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves. Developing intellectual honesty breaks through these defense mechanisms and creates the possibility for genuine self-knowledge and change. Intellectual honesty requires distinguishing between what you want to be true and what actually is true. People often believe things because they are comforting, socially acceptable or consistent with their existing worldview, rather than because they are accurate. They may convince themselves that they are more moral, more rational, or more successful than they actually are. They may deny obvious problems in their relationships or careers because acknowledging them would require difficult changes. Intellectual honesty means facing reality even when it contradicts your preferences or threatens your self-image. This is difficult work that most people avoid, but it is essential for growth and authenticity. Self-examination involves regularly questioning your own thoughts, feelings and behaviors to understand their true origins and motivations. This means asking yourself uncomfortable questions. Am I really doing this for the reasons I claim? What might I be avoiding or denying about this situation? How might I be deceiving myself about my motivations? What patterns do I keep repeating despite claiming I want to change? These questions often reveal discrepancies between conscious intentions and unconscious behaviors that explain why change is so difficult. Nietzsche understood that most people resist self-examination because it threatens their carefully constructed self-image. They prefer to maintain comforting illusions rather than face potentially disturbing truths. However, self-deception ultimately causes more suffering than self-knowledge because it prevents people from addressing real problems. The person who denies their drinking problem cannot recover from alcoholism. The individual who refuses to acknowledge their role in relationship conflicts cannot improve their relationships. The worker who will not admit their professional limitations cannot develop new skills. Self-deception feels protective in the short term, but becomes destructive over time. Intellectual honesty requires short-term discomfort for long-term benefit. Developing intellectual honesty involves creating safe spaces and methods for self-examination. This might include keeping a journal where you can explore your thoughts and feelings without judgment. It could involve working with a therapist who can provide objective feedback about your patterns. You might engage in regular meditation or reflection practices that increase self-awareness. You could seek feedback from trusted friends who will tell you difficult truths with compassion. The key is finding approaches that allow you to examine yourself honestly without becoming overwhelmed or self-attacking. Intellectual honesty also applies to examining your beliefs about the world. Many people hold opinions simply because they inherited them from family, absorbed them from culture, or adopted them from authority figures. Intellectual honesty requires questioning these inherited beliefs to determine which ones are based on evidence and which ones are based on bias, tradition, or wishful thinking. This does not mean becoming cynical or rejecting all beliefs, but rather developing the capacity to change your mind when presented with better evidence. It means being willing to admit when you are wrong and to update your beliefs based on new information. This intellectual flexibility is essential for psychological growth and adaptation. The practice of intellectual honesty ultimately leads to greater psychological freedom. When you stop deceiving yourself, you can start addressing real problems rather than imaginary ones. When you face difficult truths, you can make informed decisions about how to respond. When you acknowledge your limitations, you can work to overcome them or accept them gracefully. When you recognize your genuine motivations, you can make authentic choices. This creates a solid foundation for psychological health, based on reality rather than illusion. The truth may not always be comfortable, but it is always liberating. Intellectual honesty transforms you from a prisoner of your own self-deception to a free agent capable of genuine choice and change. Part 25. The Artist-Philosopher as Therapist. Nietzsche pioneered a unique approach to psychological healing that combined philosophical insight with artistic expression. He saw himself as both philosopher and artist, using creative writing to explore psychological truths and promote healing in himself and his readers. This model suggests that effective therapy requires both analytical understanding and creative transformation. Modern therapeutic approaches increasingly recognize the value of integrating cognitive insight with expressive arts and creative practices. Traditional therapy often focuses on analyzing problems and developing coping strategies. While this approach can be helpful, it may miss the transformative power of creative expression and aesthetic experience. Nietzsche understood that deep psychological change often requires more than rational understanding. It requires imaginative engagement with new possibilities. Art, literature, music, and other creative expressions can access parts of the psyche that resist purely rational approaches. They provide alternative languages for exploring emotions and experiences that are difficult to articulate directly. They also offer opportunities for experimentation and play that can lead to genuine transformation. The artist-philosopher approach involves treating your life as a creative project. Instead of seeing yourself as a fixed entity with predetermined traits, you recognize yourself as an ongoing work of art that can be consciously shaped and developed. This requires both the philosopher's analytical skills to understand your current patterns and the artist's creative vision to imagine new possibilities. You become both the sculptor and the sculpture, actively shaping your character through conscious choice and creative experiment. This perspective transforms personal development from a problem-solving exercise to a creative adventure. It makes growth more engaging and sustainable because it taps into natural human drives for creativity and self-expression. Creative expression serves multiple therapeutic functions. First, it provides a safe outlet for emotions that might be difficult to express directly. Writing, painting, music, or movement can help process grief, anger, fear, or joy in ways that pure talking cannot achieve. Second, creative activities often generate insights that emerge spontaneously rather than through forced analysis. Third, the creative process itself can be healing by providing flow experiences that reduce rumination and increase present-moment awareness. Fourth, creative products can serve as external representations of internal experiences, making abstract feelings more concrete and manageable. The philosophical component involves examining the meaning and significance of your experiences. This means asking deeper questions about purpose, values, and identity rather than just focusing on immediate problems. It involves exploring fundamental questions about how to live well and what makes life meaningful. Philosophy provides frameworks for understanding suffering, growth, and human nature that can contextualize personal struggles within larger patterns. It helps distinguish between surface symptoms and underlying existential issues that may be driving psychological distress. When people understand the deeper meaning of their struggles, they often find greater motivation for change and greater peace with unavoidable difficulties. Modern therapy increasingly incorporates artistic and creative elements. Art therapy, music therapy, dance therapy, and expressive writing are all established therapeutic modalities that recognize the healing power of creative expression. Narrative therapy helps clients rewrite their life stories in more empowering ways. Mindfulness-based approaches often incorporate creative practices to develop present-moment awareness. Even traditional cognitive therapies now recognize the value of metaphor, imagery, and creative exercises in promoting change. These developments validate Nietzsche's insight that healing requires engaging the whole person, not just the rational mind. Practical application involves incorporating both reflective and creative elements into your personal development work. Set aside time for philosophical reflection on questions of meaning, purpose, and values. Engage in regular creative activities that allow for authentic self-expression. Use writing, art, music, or movement to explore emotions and experiences that are difficult to articulate verbally. Experiment with different forms of creative expression to discover what resonates with your particular temperament and interests. Combine analytical understanding with imaginative exploration to achieve deeper and more lasting change. Remember that the goal is not artistic perfection, but authentic expression and personal transformation. Approach your life as both a philosophical inquiry and a creative masterpiece in progress. Part 26. Nietzschean CBT, Challenging Thoughts and Creating Values. Contemporary cognitive behavioral therapy shares important insights with Nietzschean psychology, particularly regarding the power of thoughts to shape emotional experience. However, where traditional CBT focuses on correcting distorted thinking patterns, a Nietzschean approach goes further to examine the values and assumptions underlying those thoughts. This deeper approach not only challenges maladaptive cognitions, but empowers people to create entirely new frameworks for understanding their experience. It transforms therapy from error correction to value creation. Traditional CBT identifies cognitive distortions such as all-or-nothing thinking, catastrophizing, and personalization that contribute to emotional distress. These techniques are valuable for helping people develop more balanced and realistic thinking patterns. However, a Nietzschean approach asks deeper questions. Where did these thought patterns come from? What values and assumptions make these thoughts seem believable? How might alternative value systems create entirely different ways of interpreting the same experiences? This genealogical analysis reveals that many psychological problems stem not just from distorted thinking, but from problematic value systems that need to be examined and potentially replaced. For example, someone struggling with perfectionism may benefit from CBT techniques that challenge all-or-nothing thinking. But a Nietzschean approach would also examine the underlying values that make perfectionism seem important. The belief that worth depends on performance, the assumption that mistakes are catastrophic, or the idea that others' approval is essential for self-esteem. By questioning these fundamental assumptions, the person can develop entirely new value systems that make perfectionism unnecessary rather than just problematic. They might embrace values of growth over achievement, learning over performance, or self-acceptance over external validation. This approach requires helping clients become philosophers of their own experience. Instead of simply accepting thoughts and emotions as given, they learn to examine the worldview that produces those thoughts and emotions. They ask questions like, what would I have to believe for this thought to make sense? What values am I assuming when I feel this way? How might someone with different values interpret this situation? What alternative belief systems might serve me better? This philosophical examination often reveals that emotional distress stems from inherited beliefs that no longer serve the person's current circumstances or authentic nature. By creating new belief systems, they can literally transform their emotional experience. The process involves both deconstruction and reconstruction. First, clients learn to identify and question the values and assumptions underlying their distressing thoughts and emotions. They examine where these beliefs came from and whether they still serve their well-being. This often involves recognizing how family, cultural and social conditioning has shaped their worldview in ways that may no longer be helpful. Then they engage in creative value construction, experimenting with alternative frameworks that might better support their authentic nature and current goals. This is not about adopting someone else's value system, but about consciously creating one that serves their unique circumstances and temperament. Practical techniques include values clarification exercises, where clients identify their core principles and examine how well their current thinking aligns with these values. Perspective-taking exercises help clients imagine how people with different values might interpret the same situations. Experimental behavioral assignments allow clients to test new value systems in real-world situations to see how they work in practice. Creative expression exercises help clients explore alternative ways of understanding their experience through art, writing, or role-playing. The goal is to develop flexible thinking that can adapt to different situations while remaining grounded in consciously chosen values rather than unconsciously inherited assumptions. This creates lasting change that goes beyond symptom management to fundamental transformation of how people understand themselves and their world. The Nietzschean CBT approach recognizes that thoughts are not just automatic mental events, but expressions of deeper philosophical commitments. By changing these underlying commitments, people can change not just their thinking patterns, but their entire experience of being alive. This transforms therapy from a medical model focused on fixing dysfunction to a creative model focused on constructing more fulfilling ways of being. It empowers clients to become active creators of their psychological reality rather than passive victims of their mental patterns. The result is often more profound and lasting change than traditional approaches because it addresses the roots rather than just the symptoms of psychological distress. People learn not just how to cope with their problems, but how to create lives worth living. Part 27. Trauma, Strength and Post-Traumatic Growth. Nietzsche's perspective on trauma and suffering offers a unique framework for understanding how people can not only recover from terrible experiences, but actually become stronger through them. His famous statement that what does not kill me makes me stronger is often misunderstood as minimizing trauma or promoting masochism. In reality, he was describing a psychological process where properly integrated difficult experiences can lead to genuine growth and increased resilience. This insight anticipates modern research on post-traumatic growth and provides practical guidance for trauma recovery. Trauma creates a fundamental disruption in a person's sense of safety, meaning, and identity. It shatters basic assumptions about how the world works and how much control we have over our circumstances. This disruption is genuinely devastating and should never be minimized or dismissed. However, Nietzsche understood that the process of rebuilding after trauma can potentially lead to a stronger, more authentic and more resilient self than existed before. This does not happen automatically and requires conscious effort and usually professional support. But when it does occur, people often report that they would not undo their traumatic experience despite its terrible cost because of who they became through surviving it. The process of post-traumatic growth typically involves several stages. First, There must be acknowledgement and processing of the trauma itself without minimization or premature attempts to find meaning. People need time and support to grieve what they lost and to integrate the reality of what happened to them. Second, there must be a gradual rebuilding of basic safety and stability in their current life. This often requires practical changes in environment, relationships, or lifestyle to create conditions where healing can occur. Third, there must be meaning-making that transforms the trauma from pure destruction into something that contributes to personal development. This meaning-making process is highly individual and cannot be forced or rushed. Some people find meaning through helping others who have faced similar challenges. Others discover inner strengths they never knew they possessed. Some develop deeper appreciation for life and relationships. Others find spiritual or philosophical frameworks that provide context for their suffering. The key is that the meaning emerges from the person's own reflection and integration rather than being imposed by others. Well-meaning attempts to immediately find silver linings or divine purposes in trauma often interfere with natural healing processes. People must be allowed to hate what happened to them before they can love who they became because of it. Modern research confirms that post-traumatic growth is a real phenomenon experienced by many trauma survivors. Studies show that people who experience significant trauma often report increased appreciation for life, stronger relationships, greater personal strength, spiritual development, and recognition of new possibilities. However, this growth typically coexists with ongoing symptoms and difficulties rather than replacing them. People can simultaneously struggle with trauma effects while also experiencing genuine growth from their experience. The goal is not to eliminate all traces of trauma, but to ensure that it contributes to, rather than destroys, personal development. This requires integrating the trauma into a larger story of resilience and growth, rather than allowing it to define the entire narrative. Therapeutic approaches that incorporate post-traumatic growth principles focus on helping clients identify and build upon the strengths they have developed through surviving trauma. This might include recognizing increased empathy, emotional depth, spiritual awareness, or personal courage that emerge from their experience. Therapists help clients see themselves as survivors rather than just victims, emphasizing their agency and resilience rather than only their wounds. This does not minimize the reality of trauma, but contextualizes it within a larger framework of human capacity for growth and adaptation. Practical application involves learning to see yourself as someone who has been made stronger by difficult experiences rather than simply damaged by them. This requires identifying specific ways that challenges have contributed to your growth, wisdom, or character development. Ask yourself, what strengths have I developed that I might not have otherwise? How has this experience deepened my understanding of myself or others? What would I tell someone facing a similar challenge? How can I use what I have learned to help others or contribute to something meaningful? Remember that acknowledging growth does not require being grateful for trauma or pretending it was a good thing. It simply means recognizing that human beings have remarkable capacity to transform even terrible experiences into sources of strength and wisdom. Part 28. The Psychology of Excellence and Achievement. Nietzsche's understanding of excellence and achievement differs radically from contemporary success culture. While modern society often equates achievement with external recognition, wealth, or status, Nietzsche emphasized internal mastery and authentic self-expression. His concept of excellence involves becoming who you truly are, rather than becoming what others expect you to be. This perspective provides guidance for pursuing meaningful achievement while avoiding the psychological traps of external validation and comparison with others. True excellence, in Nietzsche's view, emerges from developing your unique gifts and potential rather than conforming to external standards of success. This requires deep self-knowledge to understand your authentic interests, values, and capabilities. It means pursuing activities that intrinsically engage and challenge you rather than just those that provide external rewards. The excellent person is driven by internal motivation to master their craft and express their authentic nature. They measure success primarily by their own growth and satisfaction, rather than by comparison with others or social recognition. This creates sustainable motivation that does not depend on external circumstances or validation. The process of achieving excellence requires what Nietzsche called self-overcoming. This involves continuously pushing beyond your current limitations and comfort zones to develop new capacities. It means embracing challenges and setbacks as opportunities for growth rather than threats to your self-esteem. The person pursuing excellence develops a growth mindset that sees abilities as expandable through effort rather than fixed traits. They become comfortable with temporary failure and uncertainty because they understand these as necessary parts of the learning process. They develop resilience that allows them to persist through difficulties without losing motivation or confidence. Nietzsche distinguished between two types of achievement motivation: reactive and creative. Reactive achievement involves trying to prove your worth through success or trying to compensate for feelings of inadequacy. This type of motivation often leads to perfectionism, comparison with others, and anxiety about failure. Creative achievement involves expressing your authentic nature and developing your unique potential regardless of external validation. This motivation generates intrinsic satisfaction and tends to be more sustainable over time. People driven by creative motivation often achieve greater external success as a byproduct of their authentic engagement with their work. Modern research on motivation and performance supports Nietzsche's insights. Studies show that intrinsic motivation leads to better performance and greater satisfaction than extrinsic motivation. Research on flow states reveals that people perform best when they are fully engaged in activities that match their skills with appropriate challenges. Studies on expertise demonstrate that mastery requires deliberate practice over extended periods rather than just talent or effort. Research on well-being shows that people who pursue personally meaningful goals report greater life satisfaction than those who pursue goals imposed by others. All of this validates Nietzsche's emphasis on authentic self-development over external achievement. The pursuit of excellence also requires developing what Nietzsche called intellectual courage. This means being willing to challenge conventional wisdom, experiment with new approaches, and risk failure in pursuit of genuine innovation. Excellent people often have to go against the grain of social expectations to fully develop their unique gifts. They must be willing to be misunderstood, criticized, or rejected by those who do not appreciate their particular form of excellence. This requires strong internal validation and confidence in their own judgment. They must believe in their vision even when others do not yet see its value. Practical application involves identifying your unique combination of interests, values, and capabilities, and then structuring your life to develop these systematically. Ask yourself, what activities naturally engage and energize me? What would I pursue even if I were never rewarded for it? What unique contribution could I make that reflects my authentic nature? How can I challenge myself to grow while remaining true to my core values? Focus on developing mastery in areas that genuinely matter to you rather than pursuing achievements that only look impressive to others. Measure your progress by your own growth and satisfaction rather than by external metrics or comparison with others. Remember that true excellence is a lifelong journey of self-development rather than a destination to be reached. Part 29. Social Conditioning versus Individual Authenticity. One of Nietzsche's most important psychological insights involves the tension between social conditioning and individual authenticity. From birth, we are shaped by family, culture, education, and social institutions that teach us how to think, feel, and behave. While this conditioning serves important functions such as social cooperation and cultural transmission, it can also suppress our authentic nature and limit our potential. Understanding this dynamic helps explain many psychological problems and provides guidance for developing genuine individuality while remaining socially connected. Social conditioning operates through multiple mechanisms that are often unconscious and automatic. Children learn what behaviors are rewarded and punished, which emotions are acceptable or forbidden, and which thoughts are encouraged or discouraged. They internalize these messages as fundamental truths about reality, rather than recognizing them as cultural preferences. By adulthood, most people have thoroughly absorbed social programming that shapes their perception, judgment, and behavior in ways they rarely question. They mistake cultural conditioning for human nature and social expectations for personal desires. This creates a false self that conforms to external demands, while the authentic self remains hidden or underdeveloped. The conflict between conditioning and authenticity often intensifies during life transitions, when people question whether their current path truly reflects their genuine interests and values. They may discover that they have been living according to others' expectations rather than their own desires. This realization can be disturbing, because it suggests that much of their life has been based on false premises. However, it also creates opportunities for greater authenticity if people have the courage to examine and potentially revise their conditioning. This process requires distinguishing between social programming that serves their well-being and programming that limits their growth. Some conditioning is helpful and should be retained, while other conditioning needs to be questioned and potentially replaced. The process of developing authenticity while remaining socially functional requires careful navigation. Complete rejection of social conditioning often leads to isolation, dysfunction, or rebellion that serves conditioning in reverse rather than transcending it. Complete acceptance of conditioning leads to conformity and loss of individual potential. The goal is selective integration, where people consciously choose which aspects of their conditioning to retain and which to modify based on their authentic needs and values. This requires developing internal authority that can evaluate external expectations rather than automatically accepting or rejecting them. It means becoming the conscious author of your own character rather than the unconscious product of social forces. Modern psychology recognizes this tension in concepts such as false self versus true self, external versus internal locus of control, and conformity versus individuation. Research shows that people who live authentically report higher well-being and life satisfaction than those who conform to social expectations that conflict with their genuine nature. Studies on identity development reveal that healthy individuals go through phases of accepting, questioning, and selectively integrating social influences rather than simply accepting them wholesale. Research on creativity and innovation demonstrates that breakthrough achievements often require thinking outside conventional frameworks. Therapeutic work often involves helping clients distinguish between authentic desires and conditioned responses. This requires creating safe space where people can explore aspects of themselves that may not be socially acceptable. Clients learn to identify the sources of their beliefs and behaviors to determine which ones feel genuine versus inherited. They experiment with expressing their authentic nature in appropriate contexts, while developing skills for navigating social expectations when necessary. The goal is not social rebellion, but conscious choice about when to conform and when to assert individuality. This creates psychological freedom that enhances rather than destroys social relationships. Practical development of authenticity involves regular self-examination to distinguish between your genuine thoughts and feelings versus those you think you should have. Ask yourself, do I actually enjoy this activity, or do I think I should enjoy it? Am I pursuing this goal because it matters to me or because others expect it? What would I do differently if I did not worry about others' approval? Experiment with expressing your authentic thoughts and feelings in safe relationships to see how it feels. Notice when you are performing versus when you are being genuine. Gradually expand the context where you feel safe to be authentic while developing skills for managing social expectations when conformity is necessary. Remember that authenticity does not require rejecting all social influence, but rather becoming conscious about which influences you choose to embrace. Part 30. Becoming who you are, the ultimate therapeutic goal. Becoming who you are represents the culmination of Nietzschean psychology and the ultimate goal of therapeutic work. This famous phrase does not mean discovering some predetermined essence waiting to be revealed, but rather actively creating an authentic self through conscious choice and commitment. It involves integrating all aspects of your personality, transcending limiting conditioning, and expressing your unique potential in the world. This is both the most challenging and most rewarding work any human being can undertake, because it transforms you from a passive recipient of life to an active creator of meaning and value. The process of becoming who you are requires moving through several developmental stages. First, you must recognize that you are not a fixed entity with predetermined characteristics, but an ongoing project of self-creation. This shifts your perspective from discovering yourself to creating yourself through choices and actions. Second, you must examine your current patterns to distinguish between authentic expressions of your nature and conditioned responses inherited from others. This involves the difficult work of separating who you really are from who you have been taught to be. Third, you must develop the courage to express your authentic nature even when it conflicts with social expectations or family traditions. Fourth, you must integrate all aspects of your personality, including those you might prefer to deny or hide. This means acknowledging your shadow qualities, embracing your contradictions, and finding ways to express your full range of human characteristics in appropriate contexts. Fifth, you must take responsibility for creating your own values and meaning rather than simply inheriting them from external authorities. This requires developing internal guidance systems that can navigate life's complexities without needing constant external validation. Finally, you must commit to ongoing growth and evolution, because becoming who you are is a lifelong process rather than a final destination. You must remain open to change while maintaining core authenticity. This process requires what Nietzsche called intellectual courage and emotional strength. Intellectual courage means being willing to question fundamental assumptions about yourself and your world, even when this creates uncertainty and discomfort. It means thinking for yourself rather than simply accepting popular opinions or traditional wisdom. Emotional strength means tolerating the anxiety and loneliness that often accompany authentic living. It means persisting in your authentic path even when others do not understand or support your choices. Both qualities must be developed through practice and experience rather than simply decided upon intellectually. The therapeutic relationship serves as a laboratory for practicing authentic self-expression. In good therapy, clients learn to express thoughts and feelings they might hide in other relationships. They experiment with different ways of being and receive feedback about how these feel and function. They practice setting boundaries, expressing needs, and asserting their authentic perspective in a safe environment. The therapist models acceptance of the client's full humanity, including aspects that might be rejected elsewhere. This provides a corrective emotional experience that demonstrates the possibility of authentic relationship. Becoming who you are also requires finding the courage to live with uncertainty and ambiguity. Authentic individuals cannot rely on external authorities to tell them how to live because they must create their own path. This means making important decisions without guarantees about outcomes and taking responsibility for the consequences of their choices. It means tolerating the loneliness that sometimes accompanies authentic living because not everyone will understand or appreciate your particular way of being. However, it also leads to the deep satisfaction that comes from expressing your genuine nature and contributing your unique gifts to the world. People who successfully become who they are report a sense of aliveness and meaning that cannot be achieved through conformity or external validation. The ultimate test of whether you are becoming who you are is whether you would choose to live your life again exactly as it has unfolded. This is Nietzsche's eternal recurrence applied personally. Can you love your fate completely because it has made you who you are? This does not mean every moment has been pleasant or that you have no regrets, but rather that you recognize how all your experiences have contributed to your development. When you can genuinely say yes to your entire life, including its difficulties and failures, you have achieved authentic selfhood. You have transformed from someone who is lived by unconscious forces to someone who consciously creates their destiny. This is the ultimate goal of both Nietzschean psychology and therapeutic work, becoming a free spirit who can create meaning and value through authentic self-expression while remaining connected to others and committed to growth.